There are thousands of stories from the Second World War: airborne assaults, tank battles, cities reduced to rubble. But every so often, historians uncover something stranger, an operation so unlikely that, if it appeared in a film script, audiences would assume it had been exaggerated for drama. This is one of those stories. For nearly 80 years, it existed only as a handful of classified reports buried deep inside British military archives. No medals announced it. No wartime newspapers described it. Even many veterans of the regiment involved never spoke about it publicly. And yet, the mission happened. And to understand how 50 men pulled it off, we have to go back to the moment Italy began to collapse. In September 1943, fewer than 50 British and French commandos from the Special Air Service drove a stolen steam train deep into enemy-controlled Italy, attacked a prison camp behind German lines, freed nearly 200 prisoners, and escaped the same way they came, along a railway the enemy fully controlled. The operation was known simply as Operation LOCO, and for decades almost nobody outside classified circles knew it existed. If you enjoy real wartime stories that sound impossible but are completely documented, consider subscribing now, because this one begins quietly and only gets stranger from here, because the most unbelievable part of this mission isn't the attack, it's the decision that made it necessary. September 1943 was a moment of chaos in Italy. The Allies had landed in the south. Mussolini's regime had collapsed. Italian forces were surrendering in some regions, while German troops rushed south to seize control before the Allies could advance further. Front lines did not exist in neat lines on maps. They shifted daily. Railways, ports, and towns changed hands faster than intelligence officers could update reports. And somewhere inside that confusion sat a little-known internment facility near the town of Pisticci. The camp held a mixture of prisoners, Allied personnel, and Jewish civilians, people who had survived years of war only to face a new danger. German authorities were preparing transfers north. Once moved into Germany, rescue would become almost impossible. The window to act was closing fast. The warning reached Allied headquarters through an unexpected source: an escapee. Exhausted and barely recovered, he described a camp vulnerable, not because it was weak, but because it believed itself secure. Guards were limited. Procedures were relaxed. The war, from their perspective, still felt distant, but transport orders had already begun. The prisoners would soon disappear into the expanding German prison system. Commanders faced a brutal calculation. A conventional assault required large forces moving through territory already filling with German units. Airborne insertion risked scattering troops miles apart. Armored columns could not move fast enough through the fractured Italian road. Network. Every traditional solution failed the same test. Time. There simply wasn't enough of it. So someone suggested abandoning traditional solutions entirely. Instead of sneaking behind enemy lines, they would travel through them openly, by train. At first, the idea sounded absurd. Railways were among the most controlled systems in wartime Europe. German logistics depended on them. Patrols monitored stations. Signals governed movement precisely. But that control created an unexpected advantage. Rail traffic was constant. Freight trains, troop transports, supply locomotives, and dozens moved daily. Railway staff rarely inspected every carriage closely, especially during the confusion following Italy's surrender. A train that looked legitimate could travel enormous distances without challenge, if it kept moving. And that was the risk. A train cannot improvise. It cannot detour into forests or disappear into hills. If stopped, the raiding force would be trapped, surrounded, outnumbered, and hundreds of miles from friendly lines. The mission required soldiers to be comfortable operating in environments where escape might not exist. There was only one unit Allied planners trusted with that level of risk: the SAS. In 1943, the Special Air Service was still an experiment. Founded only 2 years earlier by David Stirling, the regiment had gained attention through daring raids across North Africa. Small teams attacked airfields, destroyed aircraft, and vanished before larger forces could respond. Their success came from thinking differently. Where conventional armies relied on numbers, the SAS relied on surprise. Where others avoided risk, they weaponized it. Operation LOCO would push that philosophy further than ever before. Major Oswald Cary-Elwes was selected to lead the mission, supported by French officer Raymond Courraud and a mixed group of British and Free French commandos. Planning focused less on firepower and more on psychology. The train had to appear ordinary. Confidence would be their disguise, because suspicion, even momentary, could destroy the entire operation. But before they could rescue anyone, they first had to steal a locomotive. Near Taranto, recently secured by Allied forces, railway operations continued amid confusion over authority and control. Italian personnel still ran much of the infrastructure, unsure which orders still applied. That uncertainty became the opening the SAS needed. The seizure of the train was executed quickly and with minimal noise. Weapons were kept out of sight. Orders were delivered with authority. The goal was not intimidation, it was normality. Within minutes, the locomotive was under SAS control. Steam pressure built. Metal wheels began to turn. And with that movement, the mission crossed a point of no return. Behind them lay Allied territory. Ahead stretched miles of track running directly through enemy-held Italy. Every station they passed increased the danger. Every mile forward reduced the chance of turning back. The commandos understood something fundamental as the countryside began to roll past. They were now depending entirely on deception, because courage could not stop a checkpoint. Firepower could not outrun a signal failure. And if the enemy realized what they were looking at, the train would become a trap on rails. The train moved north slowly at first, not because the men aboard were cautious, but because steam locomotives obey physics, not urgency. Pressure had to build. Speed had to increase gradually. Every sound echoed across open countryside. Steel wheels against rail, steam venting into the morning air. A perfectly ordinary noise. And that was exactly what kept them alive. Because nothing attracts attention faster than something unusual during wartime. The commandos stayed low inside the carriages, weapons concealed, rehearsing actions they hoped they would never need to execute. Outside, southern Italy rolled past in long stretches of farmland and scattered villages still adjusting to the sudden collapse of Mussolini's government. Italy in September 1943 existed in a strange in-between state. Some Italian units had surrendered to the Allies. Others continued fighting alongside German forces. German troops, moving rapidly to secure the peninsula, were establishing control over transport hubs and rail networks, often faster than intelligence could track them, which meant every kilometer of track ahead was unknown. And the greatest danger wasn't combat. It was paperwork. German railway control depended on schedules, signals, and authorization codes. A delayed train could trigger an investigation. A wrong routing order could result in inspection teams waiting at the next junction. The SAS didn't just need courage. They needed to look legitimate inside a system designed to detect anomalies. Railway workers along the line saw only what appeared to be another Italian locomotive conducting routine. Wartime movement. Smoke rose from the stack. Signals were obeyed. Speed remained consistent. Confidence became camouflage. Major Cary-Elwes understood something fundamental about deception operations. Hesitation creates suspicion. So the train behaved normally. It stopped when required. It moved when cleared. It followed procedure even while carrying armed commandos toward a prison camp deep behind enemy lines. Meanwhile, the mission unfolded along a second axis, one far more dangerous. Because Cary-Elwes himself was not on the train, while the locomotive pushed north, another SAS element was already driving into enemy territory by road. Using captured vehicles, Cary-Elwes led a small jeep patrol ahead of the railway line toward a critical objective, a junction that controlled access to the route leading toward Pisticci. If German forces held that junction, the train would never reach the camp. The plan required split timing. The jeep force had to arrive first, secure the crossing, and hold it long enough for the train to pass through safely, then hold it again during the escape. It was a role that carried extraordinary risk. Unlike the train team, which relied on disguise, the jeep patrol operated fully exposed. If discovered, they would face German forces without reinforcement and with limited ammunition. But this separation solved a tactical problem. If either element failed, the other might still escape. It was classic early SAS planning, decentralized, flexible, and brutally pragmatic. The deeper they moved inland, the clearer the situation became. German units were arriving faster than expected. Convoys appeared on secondary roads. Motorcycles carried dispatch riders between towns. Railway traffic increased, evidence that the Germans were consolidating control after Italy's surrender. Every new movement tightened the timeline. The prisoners at Pisticci were no longer isolated. They were about to be absorbed into the German war machine. And then, the first real test came. At one intermediate stop, railway personnel approached the locomotive. Routine inspection, the kind that happens thousands of times in wartime without consequence. But for the SAS, it represented the exact moment planners feared. An inspection meant conversation. Conversation meant questions. Questions meant risk. Accounts suggest the interaction remained brief, handled with calm authority and careful use of Italian language skills among the raiders and cooperating personnel. Nothing dramatic happened, no weapons drawn, no alarms raised, and that quiet success mattered more than any firefight. Because the mission depended on remaining invisible until the final moment. The train continued north. Inside the carriages, tension grew heavier with each passing mile. Unlike airborne raids or desert attacks, there was no sudden burst of action to release adrenaline. Only waiting. Waiting while moving deeper into hostile territory. Waiting while imagining what would happen if signals suddenly turned red and armed soldiers boarded the train. Waiting while knowing that turning back would now raise as much suspicion as continuing forward. The men checked weapons repeatedly. Sten guns, explosives, limited ammunition, carefully calculated to last only through a short, violent engagement. This was never intended to be a prolonged battle. Speed would be survival. Meanwhile, Cary-Elwes' jeep patrol reached the targeted junction. German presence was lighter than feared, but still dangerous. The SAS moved quickly, exploiting surprise rather than force. Positions were seized before defenders fully understood what was happening. Control of the junction meant control of the mission. From that moment forward, success became possible. But holding it would be another matter entirely. Because once the raid began, German response would be immediate. And everyone involved knew it. By late afternoon, the train approached its destination. And for the first time, the IAO commandos could see it. The Pisticci camp sat isolated against the Italian landscape, guarded but not expecting attack from the rail. From a distance, nothing appeared unusual. Watchtowers, fencing, routine movement. To the guards, the approaching locomotive looked like supply traffic, another ordinary arrival in a chaotic war. The train slowed, steam hissed, metal brakes screamed softly against the wheels. Inside, safety catches clicked off almost simultaneously, because the deception phase was ending, and in a matter of seconds, the mission would change from infiltration to assault. The train slowed as it approached Pisticci. Steam drifted across the tracks in soft white clouds, partially obscuring the carriages as the A locomotive rolled toward the camp perimeter. To anyone watching from the guard towers, nothing appeared unusual. Trains arrived here occasionally, supplies moved, prisoners were transferred. Routine created complacency, and complacency was exactly what the SAS had come to exploit. Inside the carriages, the commandos waited in silence. No speeches, no last-minute adjustments. Just men running through rehearsed actions in their heads, who moved first, who secured the gate, who neutralized the guard posts. Every second after disembarking would matter, because surprise does not last long in war. And the success of the entire mission depended on one fragile assumption, that the guards would hesitate for even a few seconds. The locomotive came to a halt near the camp entrance. Metal clanged softly, steam vented. For a brief moment, nothing happened. Then the doors opened. The SAS moved fast, not wildly, not shouting, but with controlled aggression built through years of training. Sten guns came up immediately as teams spread toward pre-assigned objectives. The first guards barely had time to react. Accounts indicate that confusion dominated the opening seconds. The arriving train appeared legitimate until armed men suddenly emerged from it. By the time alarms began, to sound, key positions were already being seized. Speed replaced violence wherever possible. Guards were overwhelmed before coordinated resistance formed. Within moments, firing echoed across the compound. Short bursts, precise shots. The kind of controlled engagement is designed to end fights quickly, rather than prolong them. The assault unfolded exactly as SAS doctrine intended. Small teams moved independently, each responsible for a single objective: gate control, watchtowers, communications, administration buildings. Instead of attacking as one mass, the raiders fractured into multiple simultaneous threats, creating the illusion of a much larger force. To defenders, it felt like attackers were everywhere at once, and that psychological effect mattered as much as firepower. But the most critical objective wasn't the guards. It was time. Every minute increased the chance German forces nearby would respond. The commandos needed to locate prisoners, confirm identities, and organize evacuation before reinforcements arrived. Inside the camp, chaos replaced routine. Prisoners initially struggled to understand what was happening. Many had endured years of captivity and assumed the noise meant relocation or punishment. Language barriers added confusion. Some guards surrendered quickly once resistance collapsed. Others attempted isolated defense, but were neutralized rapidly. The camp commandant, described in later accounts as a committed fascist loyalist, was captured during the assault rather than killed, an outcome that later proved significant for intelligence purposes. Meanwhile, French and British SAS soldiers moved through barracks, calling prisoners forward. The message spread slowly at first. Then, all at once, they were rescued. The emotional shift inside the camp was immediate and overwhelming. Exhausted civilians and Allied detainees emerged cautiously, unsure whether the operation was real. Years of fear made trust difficult. But the urgency of the situation forced rapid action. The train could not wait. Approximately 180 prisoners, the maximum the locomotive could safely carry, were selected for evacuation. It was a brutal logistical reality. Not everyone could leave. War often forces decisions without perfect outcomes. And just as loading began, the first signs of German response appeared. Distant vehicle engines, movement beyond the perimeter. Word had spread. The assault phase transitioned instantly into extraction. Commandos shifted from clearing buildings to defensive positioning, covering the loading process while maintaining readiness to withdraw. This moment represented the most dangerous phase of the operation. A stationary train is vulnerable. Tracks limit maneuver. If German units blocked the line ahead or destroyed the rails behind, everyone present would be trapped. Cary-Elwes's forward jeep patrol, still holding the junction miles away, now became essential. They were the only reason escape remained possible. Loading accelerated. Prisoners were helped aboard quickly, many physically weakened after long confinement. Equipment was redistributed to maintain mobility. Guards were secured. The captured commandant was brought onto the train as well, living proof of the operation's success. Smoke thickened as engineers forced the locomotive back to full pressure. Every delay increased danger. Shots began echoing from outside the camp perimeter, probing fire rather than full assault, evidence that enemy forces were still organizing. The SAS did not wait for escalation. Orders were given. The whistle sounded. And slowly at first, then faster, the train began to move. But escape would prove more dangerous than the attack itself. As the locomotive pulled away from Pisticci, the commandos understood something unsettling. They had just announced their presence to every German unit within range. The element of surprise was gone. Now they were no longer infiltrators. They were a moving target, and somewhere ahead, along miles of exposed railway, German forces would soon be trying to stop them. The rescue had succeeded. Survival was still uncertain. The locomotive gathered speed as it left Pisticci behind. For a few moments, there was only the sound of steel wheels and escaping steam, the strange calm that sometimes follows sudden violence. Inside the carriages, rescued prisoners sat in stunned silence, still trying to understand what had just happened. Hours earlier, they had been prisoners awaiting transport north. Now they were racing through wartime Italy aboard a stolen train, guarded by British and French commandos. But relief did not last long, because everyone on board understood a simple truth. The enemy now knew something was wrong, and unlike the assault, escape offered no hiding place. A train cannot disappear. It cannot leave the tracks. Its route is predictable, its speed limited, and its direction fixed long before departure. German commanders did not need to guess where the raiders were going. They only needed to stop them somewhere along the line. Inside the locomotive cab, pressure gauges climbed as engineers forced maximum performance from the engine. The rails ahead stretched through open countryside, beautiful terrain under normal circumstances, but dangerously exposed now. Fields meant visibility. Visibility meant vulnerability. The commandos positioned themselves along carriage doors and windows, watching the horizon carefully. The mission had shifted completely. This was no longer a raid, it was a running withdrawal. Meanwhile, miles ahead, Major Oswald Cary-Elwes and his Jeep patrol waited at the railway junction they had seized earlier. Their role had always been dangerous. Now it has become critical. If German troops retook the junction before the train arrived, the escape route would collapse instantly. Reports later suggested German units had already begun probing movements in the region, reacting to scattered messages about an attack at a nearby camp. Cary-Elwes men prepared defensive positions quickly, using vehicles and terrain for cover. They were not trying to win a battle, only to delay one. Back on the train, the first sign of pursuit appeared as smoke on the horizon. At first it looked like distant farm fires. Then someone recognized the pattern. Vehicles moving fast, dust trails rising behind them. German forces were mobilizing along parallel roads, attempting to intercept the railway ahead. The realization spread quietly among the SAS troopers. The enemy didn't need to catch them directly. Destroying a section of track would be enough. A single obstruction could trap everyone aboard. Weapons were checked again, ammunition redistributed. Some prisoners were moved lower inside the carriages for protection. The commandos understood that if the train stopped unexpectedly, they would have seconds, not minutes, to react. The psychological strain inside the train intensified. Unlike traditional combat, there was nothing to shoot at yet, only anticipation, only waiting, and waiting in combat is often harder than fighting. Steam locomotives also required constant management. Speed could not simply increase endlessly. Overheating or mechanical failure would end the mission as surely as enemy fire. The crew balanced urgency against survival. Push too hard, and the engine fails. Move too slowly, and interception becomes inevitable. Then the signal ahead turned red. For railway crews, a red signal is absolute. Stop. No exceptions. But stopping now meant death. The track section ahead had likely been flagged manually, either through routine disruption or early German reaction. The locomotive slowed instinctively as brakes engaged. Inside, tension spiked immediately. Commandos moved toward exits, expecting an ambush. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then a decision was made. The train would not stop. The locomotive surged forward again, ignoring the signal entirely, a gamble based on speed and shock rather than protocol. If German troops waited beyond the signal, the train would drive directly into them. But hesitation was worse. The engine roared forward. Nothing appeared. The line remained clear. Sometimes survival in war comes down to choosing the least bad option and moving before fear can intervene. Miles ahead, Cary-Elwes's patrol finally heard it. The distant whistle of the approaching locomotive. Relief mixed instantly with urgency, because German forces were now closing on their position. Short exchanges of fire erupted as enemy scouts tested the junction defenses. The SAS responded with controlled bursts, avoiding prolonged engagement while maintaining the illusion of larger numbers. Again, deception became a weapon. Dust rose on nearby roads. Time was almost gone. Then the train appeared around the bend. Steam billowed into view, followed by the dark outline of carriages packed with rescued prisoners. The timing was almost perfect. Almost. German vehicles emerged seconds later from another road approach. Cary-Elwes's men held their positions just long enough for the locomotive to pass through the junction safely. Then, in classic SAS fashion, they disengaged immediately, mounting jeeps and withdrawing at speed rather than fighting a battle they could not win. The junction fell behind them. The train continued south toward Allied territory. Behind it, German pursuit struggled to reorganize. The opportunity to trap the raiders had slipped away. Inside the train, exhaustion finally began replacing adrenaline. Men who had operated for hours on concentration alone started to feel the weight of what had happened. The rescued prisoners, many weak, some injured, realized gradually that the danger might actually ending. But nobody relaxed fully. Not yet, because until the train crossed back into Allied control, the mission remained unfinished. The countryside began to change. Fields grew wider. Villages appeared less deserted. Signals along the railway became more orderly, small signs that the train was moving closer to territory influenced, if not fully controlled, by Allied forces. No one announced it, but everyone aboard felt it. They might actually make it out. For the first time since the assault began, rifles lowered slightly. Men drank water slowly, hands still shaking from hours of sustained tension. The rescued prisoners sat quietly, some staring through carriage doors at passing farmland as if unsure whether what they were seeing was real. War had trained them not to trust sudden hope, because survival in combat rarely feels like victory at first. It feels like disbelief. Many of the prisoners had endured months, in some cases years, of confinement. Malnutrition, uncertainty, and the constant fear of transport north had reduced expectations of survival from one day to the next. Now they were moving rapidly toward freedom. Some spoke quietly with the commandos. Others simply watched. One later, a count described a rescued prisoner touching the wooden interior of the carriage repeatedly, as if confirming that movement itself meant escape. The SAS soldiers, meanwhile, remained alert. Experience had taught them that missions often fail at the very end. Complacency kills. Inside the locomotive, engineers continued monitoring pressure carefully. The train had already been pushed harder than intended during the escape phase. Mechanical failure now, even miles from enemy contact, could still prove disastrous. Every sound mattered. Every vibration drew attention. The machine itself had become as important as the men protecting it. And then came the moment nobody had planned for. Ahead, the train slowed unexpectedly, not because of enemy action, because the track itself had been damaged. Recent military traffic and rushed wartime repairs had left a section unstable. Railway workers signaled caution, forcing the locomotive to reduce speed dramatically. For several long minutes, the IC train crawled forward. To an outside observer, it looked vulnerable, stationary enough to be intercepted. Every man aboard understood the danger instantly. If German reconnaissance units were still searching, a slow-moving train was the perfect target. Commandos moved into defensive positions again, covering doors, scanning fields, watching distant roads. The emotional relief that had begun forming vanished immediately. This was the psychological rhythm of special operations. Hope followed by renewed uncertainty. Fortunately, no enemy appeared. The train cleared the damaged section and accelerated again. But the incident reinforced something important. The mission had survived not because everything went perfectly, but because small failures never compounded into a catastrophe. And slowly, almost quietly, the war began to sound different. Artillery thunder faded into the distance. Aircraft overhead no longer triggered fear. Signals along the railway were now operated by personnel aware of Allied advances. The invisible line between enemy territory and friendly ground had been crossed. No cheers erupted. No dramatic celebration followed. Just a gradual release of tension. Weapons were finally set aside. Some soldiers slept where they sat, exhaustion arriving all at once after adrenaline disappeared. For 72 hours, planning, infiltration, assault, and escape, their bodies had functioned on pure focus. Now, fatigue has claimed its due. When the train finally reached Allied-controlled lines, medical teams and officers waited in disbelief. Reports of the operation had arrived only in fragments, confusing messages describing a raid, a stolen locomotive, and hundreds of rescued prisoners. Seeing the train arrive intact confirmed what many had considered unlikely. The mission had worked. Prisoners were evacuated for treatment immediately. Several were in fragile condition but alive, a result that justified every risk taken during the operation. The captured camp commandant was transferred into custody, later providing intelligence useful to Allied investigations into collaboration and prison administration. And the SAS commandos? They did what they almost always did after operations. They disappeared back into preparation for the next mission. But the strangest part of this story was still ahead. Because instead of becoming famous, the mission almost vanished. There were no victory parades, no major press releases, no dramatic wartime headlines celebrating the raid. Official reports were filed, classified, and stored. Within weeks, larger battles across Italy dominated Allied attention. Armies advanced north. Casualty lists grew. Strategic priorities shifted. Operation LOCO became just another document inside military archives. The men involved rarely discussed it. Some never mentioned it even to family members. Part of that silence came from operational security. SAS tactics relied heavily on surprise and unconventional methods that commanders preferred not to publicize. Part came from culture. Early SAS soldiers viewed success as simply doing their job. Recognition was secondary, and so the train raid faded into obscurity. Decades passed, wars ended, histories were written, yet this mission, one of the most unusual rescue operations of the war, remained largely unknown. Until researchers began reopening archival files generations later, and discovered a story that sounded almost impossible. If a Hollywood studio had written this story in 1943, it would have ended differently. Newspapers would have printed headlines about daring commandos. Photographs of rescued prisoners would have filled Allied front pages. Medals would have been pinned onto uniforms under flashing cameras. But none of that happened. Instead, Operation LOCO quietly vanished. And the strangest part is this: it didn't disappear by accident. It was allowed to disappear. In the weeks following the raid, official reports were completed in the standard military format: timings, objectives, casualties, intelligence gained. The mission was acknowledged internally as successful. Commanders understood its value immediately. Yet outside a small circle of officers, almost nobody heard about it. The documents were marked, filed, restricted, and then buried within wartime archives. To understand why, you have to understand what the SAS actually was in 1943. Because the Special Air Service was not yet legendary. It was experimental. The SAS had been created only 2 years earlier in North Africa by David Sterling, an officer whose ideas many senior commanders initially considered reckless. Small teams operating deep behind enemy lines, sabotage instead of frontal assault, speed instead of numbers. Traditional military thinking distrusted it, but the results forced acceptance. By 1943, SAS units had already destroyed hundreds of Axis aircraft on desert airfields and disrupted supply networks across North Africa. Their success depended on one thing above all else: unpredictability. If the enemy understood how SAS operated, the advantage disappeared. Publicizing a mission involving hijacked trains, deep penetration raids, and unconventional assault methods risked revealing tactics the Allies intended to reuse. So silence became a strategy. But secrecy alone doesn't fully explain 80 years of obscurity. Something else was happening. The Italian campaign itself played a role. That same year, Allied forces were fighting brutal battles across the peninsula. Salerno, Monte Cassino, and countless smaller engagements consumed attention. Casualty numbers were enormous. Strategic progress was slow. Against that backdrop, a small commando raid, even a successful one, did not reshape the front lines. Large wars swallow small miracles. Operational. Priorities moved forward. The train raid became yesterday's news before it ever became news at all. There was also a political dimension. At the time, Allied governments were cautious about public discussion of concentration camps outside German territory. Italy's shifting allegiance after Mussolini's fall created a complicated narrative. Broadcasting details about camps, prisoners, and collaboration risked political complications during delicate negotiations with Italian authorities. Sometimes history is hidden not because it is insignificant, but because it is inconvenient. And then there was the culture of the regiment itself. SAS soldiers rarely spoke about operations. Unlike conventional units that built identity through public recognition, the SAS developed an opposite philosophy. Success meant anonymity. Talking too much risked future missions. Major Oswald Cary-Elwes himself embodied this mindset. After the war, he returned to civilian life and reportedly spoke little about the raid, even to family members. For decades, the operation existed only as fragments inside official paperwork and scattered personal notes. The men who carried it out simply moved on, which meant that for nearly 80 years, one of the boldest rescue missions of World War II existed only as a rumor, until someone started asking questions. Historian Damian Lewis encountered the story almost by accident while researching early SAS operations. Inside archival collections, including material preserved from Colonel Patty Maine's wartime records, he found a brief reference to a mission involving a train, prisoners, and Italy. At first it seemed impossible. No widely known account matched it. No major histories mentioned it. But further investigation uncovered corroborating reports written independently by multiple participants. Piece by piece, the story reassembled itself. Operational logs, after-action summaries, witness accounts. Suddenly, a mission thought lost emerged intact. What surprised researchers most was not just that the raid had happened. It was how complete it had been. Planning, execution, extraction, strategic success, all conducted by a small force operating far beyond conventional doctrine of the time. In modern military language, Operation LOCO looked remarkably familiar because it resembled missions carried out decades later by modern special forces units. Hostage rescues, deep penetration raids, precision operations relying on speed and surprise rather than overwhelming firepower. In many ways, this 1943 mission wasn't just daring. It was ahead of its time. And that realization changes how you see the SAS entirely. Because the train raid wasn't an anomaly. It was proof of something bigger. The early SAS wasn't merely participating in World War II. It was quietly inventing the future of warfare. Small autonomous teams, rapid mobility, psychological shock, use of enemy infrastructure against itself. Modern specials, operations doctrine, used today by units around the world, traces directly back to experiments like this one. The men boarding that locomotive in southern Italy didn't know they were shaping military history. They were simply solving a problem in front of them. Get in, free the prisoners, get out alive. And for decades history was forgotten, until the archives reopened, until the story resurfaced, until people realized that one of the most cinematic operations of the war had actually happened exactly as recorded, without exaggeration. But there is one final question left, a question historians still debate. Why did it work? Why did 50 men succeed where larger forces might have failed? And what made the early SAS fundamentally different from every other military unit operating at the time? That answer begins long before Italy. It begins in the desert, with a group of soldiers who refused to fight war the normal way. The train raid didn't begin in Italy. It began in failure. Because before the SAS became legendary, most senior officers believed the unit should never have existed at all. In 1941, the British Army was fighting for survival in North Africa. Rommel's Afrika Korps moved fast, struck hard, and repeatedly outmaneuvered larger Allied forces. Traditional military thinking, massed formations, rigid command structures, and predictable supply lines were proving dangerously slow against a mobile enemy. Into that frustration stepped a young Scottish officer named David Stirling. Stirling's idea sounded almost irresponsible. Instead of fighting the enemy head-on, send very small teams deep behind enemy lines. Destroy aircraft on the ground. Sabotage fuel dumps. Strike where defenses were weakest, then disappear before retaliation arrives. To conventional commanders, this sounded like suicide dressed up as strategy. But Britain was running out of options, so they allowed him to try. The early SAS operations were brutal learning experiences. The first parachute insertion in 1941 went badly wrong. High winds scattered the unit across the desert. Equipment was lost. Men were killed before even reaching their targets. Most experimental units would have been shut down immediately. Instead, Stirling adapted. He abandoned large airborne insertions and began using long-range desert vehicles guided by the Long-Range Desert Group. Mobility replaced rigidity. Surprise replaced strength. And suddenly, the results changed everything. Small SAS patrols began destroying entire airfields, not through firefights, but through precision sabotage, explosives placed directly onto parked aircraft, timed detonations, rapid withdrawal before enemy response. In a single night, a handful of men could eliminate dozens of planes that took months to manufacture. The cost-to-impact ratio stunned Allied command. War, it turned out, didn't always reward size. It rewarded imagination. And this is the mindset the men of Operation LOCO carried with them into Italy. They weren't trained to fight battles. They were trained to solve problems no one else could solve. By 1943, SAS selection had already developed a distinct philosophy. They did not look for the strongest soldiers. They looked for the calmest, men who could think clearly while exhausted, men comfortable operating far from support, men capable of independent judgment without constant orders. because a four-man patrol behind enemy lines cannot wait for permission. It must decide. Act, adapt, survive. This independence explains something crucial about the train raid. Hijacking a locomotive was not part of a standard military manual, but SAS soldiers were conditioned to exploit opportunity immediately. If a plan works, use it. If reality changes, improvise. The objective mattered more than tradition. Another defining element was trust. SAS teams operated in extremely small numbers because cohesion increased exponentially as group size decreased. Every man understood every role. Every man could step into another's task if necessary. In conventional units, hierarchy maintains order. In the SAS, mutual competence maintains survival. That difference becomes decisive during chaos. When Operation LOCO unfolded, when timing shifted, when resistance appeared, when prisoners had to be moved rapidly, the commandos did not freeze waiting for instructions. They adapted collectively. Years of training allowed decisions to happen almost instinctively. But tactics alone don't explain success. Psychology does. The early SAS embraced an idea rarely discussed openly in wartime doctrine. Confidence itself is a weapon. Enemy forces expect attacks to follow predictable patterns, large units, known routes, standard objectives. When something completely unexpected happens, like commandos arriving by train, the defender's decision-making slows dramatically. Confusion creates hesitation. Hesitation creates opportunity. At Pisticci, guards initially saw a familiar sight, a locomotive arriving as trains often did during wartime logistics movements. By the time reality became clear, surprise had already won half the battle. This psychological disruption was deliberate. SAS operations aim not just to destroy targets, but to make enemies feel unsafe everywhere. Airfields were no longer secure. Supply lines were vulnerable. Rear areas became battlefields. Operation LOCO extended that philosophy into occupied Italy. Now even rail networks, symbols of control, could become instruments of attack. There was another factor rarely acknowledged: humility. Despite their reputation, early SAS soldiers understood their vulnerability. Small teams survived by avoiding unnecessary fights. Discipline mattered more than aggression. The objective at Pisticci was not glory. It was an extraction. Free the prisoners. Leave quickly. Do not linger. That restraint is one reason casualties remained low. Success came from knowing when not to fight. And yet, even after, proving their effectiveness again and again. The SAS remained outsiders inside their own army. Many senior officers still viewed them as unconventional risks. Decorations were inconsistent, recognition uneven. Their operations are often classified longer than others. Ironically, this lack of publicity strengthened the unit's culture. They were not fighting for headlines, they were fighting for results. Which is why, after the train raid, the men simply prepared for the next mission. No celebration, no parade, just another operation completed. And this is what makes Operation LOCO so powerful today. It wasn't designed to become a legend. It became legend accidentally, decades later, when historians finally connected the scattered pieces. The men themselves never tried to make history. They were too busy making sure others survived the war. But understanding how the SAS thought raises a deeper question. If small teams could achieve effects once reserved for entire divisions, what did that mean for the future of warfare? The answer would unfold in the decades after World War II, in jungles, deserts, and cities across the world. And many of those later missions would follow a blueprint first proven by men riding a stolen train through occupied Italy. The raid is usually told as a story about commandos. But the real story begins when the shooting stops, because inside those camp gates were nearly 200 people who had already survived something most soldiers never had to face. And when the SAS arrived, many of them didn't even believe rescue was real. The prisoners at Pisticci were not one single group. They were a mixture created by the chaos of collapsing fascist Italy. Jewish civilians rounded up under racial laws. Allied prisoners of war moved south during the German retreat. Political detainees, forced laborers, men and women who had disappeared into the machinery of occupation and expected never to come back out. By September 1943, rumors had begun spreading through camps across Italy. Germany was taking direct control, and where German administration followed, deportations often followed next. Many prisoners believed they were days, maybe hours, away from being transported north. No one knew exactly what waited there. But fear travels faster than facts. So when a train arrived unexpectedly at the camp, guards initially treated it as routine logistics. Railways were the lifelines of wartime Europe. Supplies moved constantly. Transfers were common. The prisoners watched from behind the wire as smoke rolled across the sky. Another train, another unknown destination, another loss of control. Then gunfire erupted, and here's something rarely shown in films. Rescues are chaotic. Freedom does not arrive neatly. It arrives loud, confusing, and terrifying. SAS commandos moved fast through the compound, neutralizing resistance and securing control points. Orders were shouted in multiple languages: English, Italian, and French, trying to communicate urgency to people who had spent months conditioned not to move without permission. Some prisoners hesitated. Others froze completely. Psychologically, captivity creates dependency on routine. Sudden change, even positive change, can feel dangerous. Several accounts describe prisoners asking the same question repeatedly. Is this real? The commandos didn't have time for explanations. They had minutes, possibly less. An enemy response could arrive at any moment. So the operation shifted from assault to organization. Names weren't checked, papers weren't verified. There was no bureaucracy. Anyone who could move was moved. The limitation was brutal. The locomotive could carry roughly 180 people safely. There were more prisoners than space allowed. And this is one of the most human and painful realities of the mission. Choices had to be made quickly. Priority went to those most at risk and those physically capable of surviving the journey back. Through contested territory. Some prisoners helped lift weaker companions aboard. Others reportedly refused seats so families could stay together. War compresses moral decisions into seconds. Meanwhile, outside the camp, the clock was running out. Because surprise never lasts forever. German and remaining fascist forces began reacting to reports of gunfire and disruption along the rail network. Communications were fragmentary. Italy was collapsing politically, but something unusual was clearly happening, and trains were easy to track. Unlike desert raids or airborne insertions, a locomotive cannot hide. It must follow rails, which meant the escape would become a race. As the prisoners were loaded, Major Oswald Cary-Elwes faced a familiar SAS dilemma: leave immediately and risk disorder on board, or delay slightly to ensure survival once the train began moving. He chose speed. The locomotive pulled away under pressure, carrying commandos, rescued prisoners, and one unexpected passenger, the captured camp commandant. That decision mattered. Capturing him provided intelligence and later legal accountability, something Allied authorities increasingly valued as evidence of occupation crimes emerged. Inside the train, conditions were overwhelming. Many prisoners had not eaten properly for weeks. Some were injured. Others were emotionally numb. The sudden transition from captivity to escape produced shock as much as relief. SAS soldiers shared rations and water while maintaining defensive positions along the cars. Every bridge, every bend in the track could conceal an ambush, and the men guarding the train knew something important. They were no longer conducting a raid. They were escorting civilians. The mission had transformed. Failure now meant massacre. But the strangest part of the story is what didn't happen. There was no dramatic final battle, no cinematic last stand, just tension stretching mile after mile. German forces attempted to respond, but Italy in September 1943 was administrative chaos. Units were redeploying. Loyalties were uncertain after the Italian surrender. Communications between commands were inconsistent. That confusion, the same chaos that made the raid possible, now protected the escaping train. Speed became survival. Eventually, Allied territory came into reach, and for the first time since boarding, many prisoners allowed themselves to believe they might actually live. When the train finally crossed into friendly control, witnesses described exhaustion more than celebration. Men sat silently. Some cried, others simply slept where they stood. The SAS soldiers, according to later recollections, reacted almost matter-of-factly. Mission completed. Objective achieved. Prepare for debrief. But here's the part that turns this story from remarkable into mysterious. Nearly 200 lives had just been saved. A concentration camp had been raided. Enemy territory penetrated by rail. And yet, almost nobody heard about it. No headlines, no medals announced publicly, no victory propaganda. It was as if the mission had never happened. And for 80 years, it almost hadn't. You would expect a mission like this to become legend overnight. A hijacked train. A concentration camp raid. Nearly 200 prisoners were rescued deep behind enemy lines. In almost any other war, it would have filled newspapers. But this one didn't. Instead, it disappeared. When the SAS returned to Allied control, the operation followed the normal military process. Debriefings, intelligence summaries, operational reports. Everything was documented, every movement, every shot fired, every prisoner recovered. And then something unusual happened. The paperwork stopped moving. In wartime bureaucracies, success usually travels upward quickly. Victories are useful, politically and psychologically. Governments promote them to maintain morale at home and confidence among allies. But Operation LOCO, the train raid, was quietly categorized, stamped, filed, restricted, not celebrated, not denied, simply buried. So why hide success? The answer has less to do with heroism and more to do with timing. September 1943 was one of the most unstable moments of the entire war in Europe. Italy had just surrendered to the Allies. But surrender didn't mean peace. German forces immediately launched Operation Axis, rapidly occupying former Italian territory and disarming Italian units. Northern and central Italy became a chaotic battlefield overnight. Allied commanders faced a fragile political reality. They needed Italian cooperation. Publicizing a raid that exposed concentration camps on Italian soil, guarded partly by Italian personnel, risked humiliating a nation they were now trying to turn into an ally. Diplomacy sometimes outranks publicity. There was another concern: intelligence. The SAS in 1943 was still experimental, a new kind of warfare unit using unconventional methods. Sabotage, infiltration, deception. The train raid revealed something dangerous to enemy planners. Allied special forces were capable of penetrating deep logistical networks, hijacking transport infrastructure, and extracting personnel without large formations. If widely publicized, German commanders could adapt quickly. Rail security would tighten. Future operations would become harder. So secrecy protected future missions. But secrecy alone doesn't explain 80 years of silence. Wars end. Archives open. Stories resurface. This one didn't. After the war, attention shifted to larger narratives. Normandy, Stalingrad, the atomic bomb, liberation of major camps in Germany and Poland. Smaller operations, even extraordinary ones, were overshadowed. And SAS culture itself contributed to the disappearance. Unlike many military units, Early SAS veterans rarely publicized their achievements. The regiment developed a quiet professional ethos. Do the job, write the report, move on. Major Oswald Cary-Elwes reportedly spoke very little about the mission, even within his own family. No memoir campaigns, no press tours, no effort to claim recognition. Without advocates, stories fade. Then came classification inertia. Files marked top secret during wartime were often archived without review. Thousands of documents entered storage at Britain's National Archives in Kew. Decades passed. Historians focused elsewhere. And Operation LOCO became a single paragraph buried among thousands of operational notes, almost invisible. Until one historian read a line that didn't make sense. While researching SAS operations, historian Damian Lewis encountered a brief reference describing a train seizure and prisoner liberation. It seemed implausible. No major histories mentioned it. No widely known citations existed. At first, Lewis reportedly assumed it was an exaggeration or clerical error. But curiosity is powerful. He kept digging. One report became two. Two became three. Different officers described the same operation from separate perspectives. Cross-referenced dates, matching locations, consistent casualty reports. This implausible story began aligning perfectly. It hadn't been a myth. It had been forgotten. As more documents surfaced, details confirmed the scale. Approximately 50 SAS commandos involved, a captured locomotive used for penetration and extraction, roughly 180 prisoners liberated, enemy personnel captured alive. Successful withdrawal back to Allied lines. The deeper Lewis went into the archives, the clearer the pattern became. The mission had never been erased. It had simply never been told. And when the story finally reached the families of the men involved, many heard it for the first time. Relatives of participants reportedly learned details decades after the war ended. Some had grown up knowing only fragments, vague mentions of Italy, trains, or a rescue job. The full scope had remained hidden even from those closest to the soldiers. This silence reflects something fundamental about early Special Forces culture. Recognition was secondary. Survival and mission success were everything. By the early 20s, publication of archival research finally brought Operation LOCO into public awareness. Historians began reassessing its significance, not just as a daring raid, but as an early blueprint for modern special operations. Precision infiltration, rapid assault, hostage extraction, and strategic psychological impact, all conducted by a small autonomous force. Techniques now standard among modern special forces were being improvised in real time by men operating with limited communication and minimal support. But perhaps the most remarkable part of the story isn't the secrecy. It's what the mission revealed about the SAS itself. Because the Great Train Raid wasn't an exception. It was a preview, a glimpse of how warfare was about to change forever, and why, decades later, special forces around the world would still study what happened on that train in September 1943. History remembers the loud victories. The beaches were stormed by thousands. The cities were liberated by armies. The battles that shake continents. But sometimes, the wars are quietly changed by 50 men on a train no one was supposed to know about. When Operation LOCO ended, there were no victory parades, no headlines, no medals announced to cheering crowds. The rescued prisoners disappeared into refugee processing systems. The SAS commandos returned to operational duty. The war continued moving forward, indifferent to individual acts of brilliance. And that was exactly how the men involved expected it to be. Because the early Special Air Service operated under a simple philosophy. Success was measured by impact, not recognition. At first glance, the Great Train Raid looks like an extraordinary rescue mission. But historians now see something deeper. It represented a turning point in how wars could be fought. Before units like the SAS, Military thinking relied on mass, more soldiers, more artillery, more firepower. Operation LOCO demonstrated something radical for 1943. A small, highly trained unit could achieve strategic effects traditionally requiring entire battalions. 50 men disrupted enemy logistics, exposed concentration camp operations, rescued civilians, captured intelligence, and escaped, all inside hostile territory. That idea would reshape modern warfare. Today, almost every elite military unit on Earth operates using principles first proven by missions like this one. But in 1943, it was an experiment, and experiments are risky. The SAS had been formed only 2 years earlier by David Sterling in North Africa. Many senior commanders initially viewed the unit as reckless, even unnecessary. Traditional officers believed war should remain predictable and hierarchical. The SAS believed unpredictability was the weapon. Operation LOCO validated that belief. Speed replaced size, surprise replaced numbers, initiative replaced rigid command structures. Modern hostage rescues, counter-terror raids, and deep reconnaissance missions all trace conceptual roots back to operations like this. But beneath doctrine and strategy were ordinary men operating under extraordinary pressure. Most were young. Many had already survived brutal campaigns in North Africa. They understood something civilians often don't. Heroism rarely feels heroic in the moment. It feels like responsibility. When the train rolled toward Pisticci, those commandos didn't know if they would return. Rail lines could be destroyed. German reinforcements could arrive. Aircraft could spot them. Every mile deeper into enemy territory reduced their odds. And yet they continued, not because survival was guaranteed, but because the prisoners waiting behind barbed wire had none at all. That's the part history often forgets. The raid wasn't just daring. It was time-critical. Intelligence suggested prisoners were at risk of transfer northward into the expanding Nazi camp system, a movement that often meant disappearance. Delay meant death. Speed mattered more than safety. The hijacked train wasn't theatrics. It was a necessity. And in that decision lies the essence of special operations thinking. Act before the enemy understands what's happening. For decades, the men carried the memory privately. Some returned to civilian life without ever explaining where they had been. Families knew fragments, Italy, commandos, dangerous work, but rarely the full story. This silence wasn't a secret for drama. It was culture. SAS veterans believed talking too much about past operations diminished the professionalism of the work. The motto wasn't marketing, it was instruction. Who dares wins, not who dares gets credit. When historians finally uncovered the archived reports 80 years later, something remarkable happened. The story didn't feel outdated. It felt modern. Because the world now understands special forces in a way people in 1943 could not. What once looked unbelievable now reads like the origin story of an entire form of warfare. The train raid wasn't ahead of its time. It created its time. And maybe that's why this story matters today. Not because it's cinematic, but because it reveals something uncomfortable about history. Some of the most important events never become famous. They sit quietly in archives, waiting, not for recognition, but for someone curious enough to look. The men of the 2nd SAS didn't set out to become legends. They set out to solve a problem, rescue the prisoners, get out alive, complete the mission. They succeeded so completely that the world moved on without noticing. Somewhere in southern Italy in September 1943, a steam train moved through occupied territory carrying men who should have remained prisoners. Inside were exhausted civilians, stunned guards, and commandos, already preparing for whatever came next. No cameras followed them. No crowds waited at the destination. Just another operation finished, and another war still raging. For 80 years, the tracks of that journey faded into silence. Until now. And maybe that's the real legacy of Operation LOCO. Not that it was unbelievable, but that it proved something timeless. History isn't only written by armies. Sometimes it's written by a handful of men bold enough to change the direction of a train. End.